go ahead and get started. I know we might have some other folks joining us, but we will get them caught up as we get here, or as they get here, rather. So thanks so much to those of you in the chat who are sharing a little bit about who you are, where you're from, where you're at in the cycle. I think that you'll find that this workshop is really well suited for folks no matter where you're at in your cycle. So if you're kind of just actively applying and looking for some last minute tips, this could be a great resource for that. If you're looking to plan ahead a little bit, right, and starting to get a sense of what it is that you need to be planning for in the coming cycle or the cycle after, I'm really excited to be working with you all tonight to share a little bit more about that. So a little bit about me. My name is Krysta. I have been working in the coaching space for about the last 5 years. I work full-time at a large research university here in the Midwest, and have been coaching on Leland for about the last year. I've worked with hundreds of students over that time period, some applying to jobs and graduate school programs, but the majority of those have been students just like you who are looking to get into medical school. So really excited to be able to chat with you all about this process. I know that it can be so overwhelming, and so I'm hoping that maybe by the end of the evening, you'll feel a little less overwhelmed, a little bit more ready to take on some of those challenges. So as we get going tonight, I want us to start by reflecting on these competencies from the AAMC. So the workshop tonight is really focused around personal statements and activity sections. That's where we're going to spend the majority of our time. But as we're having that conversation, something you'll hear me reference a lot is this list of competencies from the American Association of Medical Colleges. So for those of you who are applying via AMCAS MD programs, this is a list you might have seen before, or you at least recognize that AAMC acronym. What I love about this list is that our DO schools, so our COMIS counterparts, have also adopted this list of competencies. And so what's really neat about this is that essentially this list becomes sort of a job description, right? So med schools, MD and DO alike have said these are the things that we're looking for in incoming medical students, right? So when I'm working with applicants, what I really try to center in on is how can we demonstrate as many of these competencies in your application as we possibly can, right? So through your personal statement, we're looking to highlight probably 2 to 3 of these in each of your body paragraphs. For each of your activities, once we start talking about those entries, we're incorporating 1 to 2 of those in each of your entries. The reason that that's so important, right, is I think oftentimes we get really stuck on what is it that med schools are looking for, right? And this is it. This is the list. These are the qualities that they're looking for in future physicians. And so when I've worked with applicants, again, we find a lot of success in really kind of centering our application around these competencies. So again, because this is something that you're going to hear me yap about a lot tonight, I wanted to make sure that we kind of start off with that to make sure that we're all kind of speaking the same language, so to speak. So as we start thinking about those competencies, we want to think about them within the context of the opportunities and the experiences we've had thus far, right? So tonight, we're really going to be focusing in on how can we take the experiences that you've had and translate those into your medical school application, right? How can we talk about the ways in which working with patients has helped you to develop your empathy and compassion, as well as your ability to explain really complex subjects, right, in an accessible way? How might we touch on your volunteer work and how that's helped you to develop your ability to work within a team and collaborate with others? Maybe how your leadership role, either as a teaching assistant or as a student org leader, right, has really helped you to become more adaptable, right? How have you learned to pivot? How have you learned to persist despite challenges that you might have faced? In your research, right, we're thinking about scientific inquiry, we're thinking about critical thinking skills, and then in some of those personal connections, right, a lot of different competencies can be affiliated with those. And again, right, that list of 17 competencies could show up in any of these types of experiences. This is just kind of meant to give you some examples of what that could look like. So we're going to go ahead and roll on into the personal statement. And so what I hear from folks oftentimes, right, is that this personal statement is so tough because it's a really different type of writing than y'all are used to doing. Right, the last couple of years, you've probably written a lot of lab reports, right, perhaps some scientific papers, maybe even journal articles, but your personal statement is so different because we want to make sure that we're focusing in on you, right? And essentially the prompt for this essay becomes, why do you want to be a physician? In terms of our logistics, we're looking at about 5,300 characters for both the AMCAS and ACOMAS application. So we'll want to use a character counter for that. It all kind of depends. I know a lot of people are like, what is that in terms of page limit? Depends kind of on like single space versus double spaced, font size, all that kind of stuff. But 5,300 characters, which is essentially going to give us a quick intro where we're going to talk about your interest in medicine, 3 body paragraphs where we're going to highlight your skills, and then we're going to wrap things up in a conclusion. And within those 5 paragraphs, that content, we really want to center on your motivation, right? So what got us here? Why are we interested in medicine? How have we prepared ourselves, right? Why are we a good fit? And then what is our long-term vision in terms of the type of impact we'd like to have? So let's start off with a couple of do's and don'ts. So the very first do is that we want to make sure that we answer the question, why do you want to be a physician, right? And I know that that sounds really baseline, but a lot of times some folks will come to me with their personal statements, and they're this really long story about maybe their own experience with medicine. And while that can be a great lead-off anecdote, we really want to make sure that we're leaning into your skill set, right? That we're highlighting the reasons that you want to be a physician and how you've developed yourself in becoming ready for that work. Because of that, we want to make sure we're making meaning of your experiences. We want to find a specific angle. We want to tell some stories, right? In each of your body paragraphs, essentially, we're going to pick one of the experiences that's been super impactful, and we're going to focus in on the skill sets that you've developed as a result of that experience that really translate to the field of medicine. Throughout the process, I want to make sure that you're getting multiple opinions, but that you're also maintaining your voice. At the end of the day, you have to be happy with your personal statement, right? And it needs to sound like you. It needs to be reflective of the type of practitioner and physician that you're going to be. So certainly coaches, friends, family, right? We would all love to weigh in. And at the end of the day, we really want to make sure that it still sounds like you, right? So when I work with folks, I'm really focused on, okay, are we getting across, right, like those skills, those competencies, but I still want that to be in your voice, right? When you're working with a coach, one of the things you should really think about, is this somebody who helps my voice to shine through as opposed to replacing it with theirs? Your personal statement can also be a great place for you to address any discrepancies in your application. So I think if anything, the last 5 years has really taught us anything can happen, right? Worldwide pandemic, maybe personal struggles, right? Related to our health or related to our family. There's lots of things that can come up, right? And so if you're in a situation where you're like, gosh, like I had this one semester that was really just a struggle. Maybe I had to take some time off to care for a family member, to take care of myself, right? This can be a good place for us to address that. And that's absolutely something that we can talk about one-on-one in a coaching appointment. And then finally, I want to make sure that we're writing well and proofreading, right? If you'll remember, one of those competencies is written communication, right? And so there's no better way for us to demonstrate your ability to write than in your personal statement. So because this is serving as a persuasive piece in terms of how we present your stories, right, as well as a writing sample, we want to make sure that we're going through and doing those final grammar checks, spelling checks, making sure we're using the right word here or there, making sure that everything is really, really tight. So let's get into the don'ts. So my very first one is I don't want you to speak in cliches or generalities. And what that typically ends up looking like when I work with pre-med students is that their personal statement ultimately boils down to, I like science and I want to help people, right? And I always say the best and worst thing about that is that everybody who's going to med school, hopefully, right, likes science and wants to help people. So we need to find what's unique about your story. And it doesn't have to be dramatic, right? You don't have to have this big, crazy life event that you've gone through that has led you to medicine. But what we do need to do is spend some time really making meaning of those experiences, right? What is it that you learned from your research experience? What were the skills that you developed as a medical assistant? And how do we share those with the committee in a way that's specific? I don't want you to feel pressured to talk about traumatic events, right? So again, this idea of like, you have to have this crazy story to get into medical school. I think there's a lot of samples on the internet where folks will talk about a really traumatic experience that happened either to them personally or happened to a really close friend or family member, and that's why they got into medicine, right? And what I want you to remember is your trauma isn't going to get you into medical school, right? You don't have to exploit your trauma to get into medical school. You have worked too hard and have too many skills for us to rely on anything but that for your personal statement. So If there is a situation that you would not feel ready to talk about in an interview, I would suggest that we don't include it in your personal statement. Anything we include in your application packet can be fair game for schools for interviews. And on a day where you're already nervous, you're already anxious, right? I don't want you to also have to worry like, oh gosh, what if they asked me about this week-long stay in the hospital I had when I was 5 that I still am not really over, right? Or whatever that situation is for you. So a caveat that I always like to add, last but not least, we don't want to repeat information from your resume. And what I mean by that is that we don't want to list out the tasks that you completed in each of your roles, right? Of course, your medical assistant role is going to appear on both your resume and in your application somewhere, right? Of course, your research position going to appear on your resume and in your application. But on your resume, we're giving quick bullet points, right? We're talking about the tasks that we completed. We're talking about how we completed those tasks. We're maybe talking a little bit about the impact. But in your personal statement, we're picking out a really specific story from those experiences, right? So while you might detail in your medical assistant role on your resume, right, how you took patient vitals and you collaborated with the front office staff on insurance paperwork, right? Like when we go to your personal statement, instead, what we want to be focused on is a time where you really had the opportunity to connect with a patient, right? Or when you really understood what it meant to be a member of the healthcare team and how you came to define that role, right? So we're sharing a specific story as opposed to listing your tasks the way that we might on a resume. So I mentioned earlier kind of these 3 main areas that we want to take into consideration, right? Motivation, fit or capacity, and then vision. So our motivation is typically what inspired us to go down this path, right? How did we get here? But then also, how does that motivation grown over time, right? I think I've heard a lot of stories over the years of, well, I just always knew I wanted to be a doctor, right? But once you knew that, what were the steps that you actively took that helped you to pursue that, right? Or when you got that doctor's kit when you were 4 years old, right? Maybe that's kind of what inspired it, but maybe what really brought you to that work, right, was your first time shadowing and seeing the impact that physicians were able to make with patients, right? So again, we want the committee to get a snapshot of who you are right now and not who you were when you're a little kiddo getting your first doctor's kit. On that note, we really want to talk about how you've developed the skills and how you hold the same values that will align with the profession, right? And so this is again where those story pieces come in. We really want to hone in on, because of your work, right? Because of your volunteer experience, because of your job you had during school, how did you develop the skills, those competencies, right? That you will need in order to be a successful physician. And then finally, we want to think about your long-term vision, right? And this can be as specific or as nebulous as you want it to be, right? I have some students who say, I just really want to make an impact for folks who come from marginalized communities. And I don't know exactly what that looks like yet in terms of specialty, but I know that I want to provide folks with patient education that is empathetic and well-informed, right? I have other folks who say, okay, I want to work with marginalized populations. And specifically, someday I'd like to open up my own free clinic. I want to be addressing issues of access to healthcare, right, through legislative lobbying, in addition to running my practice, right? And so both of those are totally fine, but we do want to have some semblance of what are those different values or skills that you want to employ in your work. Essentially, right, what is the type of impact you want to have? I want to think really big and broad about that, and then hone it down if we're able to. All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty of essays. So, as I mentioned earlier, your personal statement is going to include an introduction, 2 to 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. So, each of those paragraphs, those body paragraphs in particular, is going to center around one experience. And it's going to include a reference from, I'm going to say 1 to 2, maybe 2 to 3 if we're really good, of those competencies that we talked a little bit about earlier. So within your introduction, this is where we get to share some of that motivation, right? Again, where did this interest come from and how has it matured over time? This is a great place for you to share an anecdote or a story about how you became interested in medicine that really highlights those competencies that you want to embody in your own practice, right? Some of the most effective essays I've read center around, in that very first paragraph, a physician that somebody had shadowed, right? And how they demonstrated a commitment to empathetic patient education through their practice, right? And how they took on a leadership role with their staff. And so those were things that they mentioned in their intro. And then we go on to, in the body paragraphs, talk about how that applicant also has that skill set based on their experiences, right? So again, anecdotes, stories, great ways to start this off. Can be something you observed, something you participated in, something you experienced that happened to you, if that's something you're comfortable talking about. And ultimately, that's going to lead into your thesis, where we're really going to start to define the competencies, the values, and the skills that you're going to outline in the rest of your essay, right? This is that sentence that says, in this paper, I will talk about, without saying, in this paper, I will talk about. So again, just kind of gives the committee a roadmap for where the rest of our essay is headed. So then the fun part comes in our body paragraphs. And again, we're kind of going to repeat this process 2 to 3 times throughout the essay. But when we think about our body paragraphs, I want you to think about each of them as doing 3 main things. So the first is that we're going to introduce the skill, the value, or the competency, and the experience that this paragraph is going to focus on, right? So let's say we're going to write a paragraph about your volunteer work at the Refugee Development Center, right? Maybe your city has a place where you're able to go and volunteer, to tutor, to help folks to find homes as they're getting settled here in the US. Maybe we're going to really touch on that like cultural competence and empathetic care piece, right? So then we're going to go back to the story, right? We want to give a really specific story about a time that you embodied that value, right? So in reflecting on your volunteer work, we're going to think about how we demonstrated that cultural competence, right? We're going to think about how did we display empathetic communication. And then we want to summarize how we're going to use that in your practice, right? So as a future physician, here is how I'm going to use that, right? Here is the way that I think empathy and cultural competence plays a role in empathetic care. Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Tashir. I saw that, Ryan, you had a question about going back to the intro slide. Looks like Tashir already grabbed it. Amazing. Perfect. Okay. So then finally, we're going to go to your conclusion. So in your conclusion, this is a chance for us to reiterate our thesis statement and then to talk about our long-term vision and goals, right? So again, we're thinking back to what were the main values that we had outlined in that intro paragraph and how are those going to inform the way that we practice medicine in the future, right? Your conclusion is just a way for us to kind of wrap everything up and bring it all together. All right, before we go ahead and jump into activities, we're doing pretty good on time. So I want to give us a couple minutes to talk through any of the questions you might have about personal statements more specifically. So we'll do personal statement questions now. And then after the activity section, we'll do questions about activities and everything else having to do with the application. Happy to answer your questions there. So anything specific to personal statements that's helpful for me to go back over, things I didn't touch on that you want to make sure you get answers to this evening. Give you just a couple minutes if you want to pop things in the chat. Okay, I will keep an eye on the chat, but we will go ahead and keep on rolling then. So in our activity section, I first want to again kind of go through the logistics just like we did with the personal statement, right? So again, tonight's presentation is mostly focused around AMCAS and ACOMAS because those are our 2 major application systems that folks are going to be using. If you do have questions about the Texas applications, we can talk a little bit more about that offline for sure. So within the AMCAS application, you're going to get 15 entries in your activity section. With each of those 15 entries, you'll get 700 characters to talk about each of them. It's a real short paragraph. It's like maybe 3 to 5 sentences. It's super quick, goes by really fast. But then of those 15, you get an additional 3, or rather within those 15, you get to select 3 that are your most meaningful. And for those, you get an additional 1,325 characters. So typically what that'll look like is we'll do a brief description within the 700 character, and then the 1,325 is maybe where we'll focus in a little bit more on a story for just those 3 most meaningful. With the ACOMAS application, we get unlimited entries, but they're only 600 characters apiece. So sometimes for the AMCAS application, if you've been involved with a club for a number of years and you've had multiple leadership positions, in the AMCAS application, we might group all of that together, right? Both your role as a treasurer and as the president of your pre-med society, right? But maybe in a COMIS, we're able to split those out because we get unlimited entries and then we get a little bit more space to talk about them. So again, there are ways that we can alter the applications just slightly to kind of play to each of the system's limitations. So within those activities descriptions, we're focusing on three things. So we're thinking about our tasks. So what did we do? We're thinking about skills. So what did we learn? And then application, which is how are we going to use this in our future practice? So we're going to go into some do's and don'ts again. So I do want you to talk about what you did, but I want you to be really brief about it, right? So that task piece, give me one quick sentence talking about what it is that you did, right? When I have folks do this, something that I really have them try to think about is the fact that most med school application reviewers recognize what an MA usually does, right? How do we differentiate ourselves a little bit more, right? That's where we focus on the skills. So again, because most folks are going to know what what an MA or what a research assistant does, we want to make sure that we're being really brief in talking about those tasks. Then we want to, again, make meaning of our experiences, right? Think about what's unique about your perspective, right? Really go back to the competencies and think about, in my role as an MA, how do I feel like I developed my skills, right? What skills did I develop? What did that look like? How did I go about doing that? And then we want to make sure that we're applying what we've learned and how you would use it in the future, right? So as a future practitioner, I want to make sure that I am providing accessible information to patients, making a commitment to effective communication, right, in a way that helps them to understand their diagnosis. For the most meaningful, we want to make sure that we tell a story. Again, that 1325 is a great way for us to dive a little bit deeper into that experience and to highlight a specific scenario. And then I ultimately want you to choose what's most meaningful to you. I get a lot of questions from folks about what do med schools want to see as my most meaningful, right? And what they want to see as your most meaningful is what's actually genuinely important to you, right? It's going to show in your application when you talk about something you're excited about versus you are talking about something because you feel like you're supposed to. So genuinely pick the things that have been most impactful as part of your journey. Dashir, I see you had a question. We will definitely get to that at the end. And then there's a quick question about, is this being recorded? Yes, it is. And so Leland typically gets me that recording shortly after. So I should be able to get that to you all by the end of the week for sure. All right. So some of those don'ts. We don't want to go into too much detail about the tasks. I think we've kind of covered that already, right? Short and sweet. Give me a basic overview of what you did. Don't include experiences that weren't really impactful, right? Especially because we have such limited space in the application. We want to use every piece of it to our advantage as long as it's actually meaningful, right? The last thing you want to have happen is that the committee is trying to wade through your application, trying to figure out what are the things that you've really invested time in, that you've made meaning of. We want to make sure that you are sharing the things that have been impactful. An example of that I often give is, let's say that maybe you're part of a student organization that you don't go to very often, but maybe one time you went to a soup kitchen and you're like, oh, like technically that would count for like 6 hours of volunteer work. And that's fine. But also if you went and you handed out food, that's great. And thank you for doing that. Really important, right? To give back to the community. And if there was nothing about that experience that really stood out to you about this was something that informed the way I would approach medicine, right? Maybe that's something that we're not including. So again, right, if you are at the soup kitchen every week and you're building relationships with those folks and you're really gaining a strong understanding of the systemic issues that lead to the homelessness epidemic in our country, right? That's something I want you to talk about. If you went to a volunteer event one time, right, let's say maybe it was like a dance marathon even, right? And you went and you danced and it was fun and it was great. That's awesome. But if there wasn't anything that you really gained in terms of your competencies, we'll probably leave that off your application. So it is always, always, always quality over quantity. That being said, don't undersell yourself. I'll sometimes have students who say, like I haven't really done that much, right? And then I'll say, okay, well, like, tell me, have you worked in the clinic? And they're like, oh yeah, like I have a job during the summer when I go home. Okay, that's amazing experience, right? We absolutely want to talk about that. Or, I took this class and it had a research component, but I didn't think that I should include it. You absolutely should, right? Any of those experiences that are, again, relating back to your development of the competencies are things that we want to include in that activity section. So, again, we want those descriptions to have 3 parts, and you'll see kind of based on the size of the boxes here, how much time I want you to be spending on each of these. So first, I want you to real succinctly outline what you did. Then I want you to talk about the skills that you developed and how you developed them, right? So if you were working as a medical assistant and that helped you to develop your ability to empathize with patients while also working in a collaborative team-based environment, right? Like that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. And then how will you use this? Perhaps that's where we're going to outline, right? Like how you will use your understanding of the clinical environment to take a leadership role in the future, and how you'll balance that with empathetic patient care, right? So again, we always want to bring that piece back of how are we actually going to use this experience, right? We want to show schools that we have done the work to make meaning of our experience and that we recognize why it's valuable to our work as a physician. So let's talk a little bit about timeline. For those of you who are applying this cycle, I know that you're probably seeing a lot of information on the internet about timelines, right? And whether or not it's still okay for you to apply. It's absolutely okay for you to apply. I have folks who apply technically you can apply all the way through December. Would I advise that you wait until November, December? Absolutely not. But if we can be in before Labor Day, right? So that very first weekend in September here in the States, that's still going to put us in a competitive position for most schools. So if you are waiting on an MCAT score, or you really just needed to get through your semester before you were ready to apply, right? That's totally fine. There's going to be a lot of information on the internet about folks saying like you needed to submit as soon as the application opened at the end of May. And I'm here to tell you that that's absolutely not true. But I do want to go over this full timeline for those of you who might be working a little bit further in advance. So essentially, this whole process is going to take about 2 years to apply to medical school, which is really wild to think about. But when we're thinking about prep and then the actual application, right, there's about a year dedicated to each of those. So for folks who are applying for this cycle, a lot of them started their prep last summer. So the summer of 2024 was when they were getting ready for their MCAT, they were testing, and then they were starting to work on their materials, right? That personal statement and that activity section, starting to just kind of compile, right, throughout that summer, fall, and then the early parts of the spring, all of the materials that they wanted to include within their application. Folks started applying as early as May 29th, 27th this year. And again, you can technically apply all the way through December. But ideally, right, I would love for you to be in by Labor Day at the very, very latest. Students who started applying early will start to hear back about their secondary applications in July. But again, secondary applications go out starting in July and go out all the way through probably like October, November. And then interviews will start right around August, and those will go all the way until March of 2026. So again, right, if you're applying a little bit later, just know your process is going to look a little bit different, right? Your timeline might be just a little bit later than folks who applied right when the application opened, right? But it's still coming. Right. There's no reason to think, right, if you've put together a competitive application that you won't hear things back. I have a lot of students who will hit kind of like a panic moment around November, December, if they haven't heard anything. And, maybe they applied in like July or August and they're like, well, it's December and I haven't heard anything. Well, there's still 3 months of interviews at that point. So I want you to keep that in mind as you're going through this process, whether it's this year or in the next couple of years, but just that this can all take a very long time. So for the students who are starting to apply right now, they'll start to kind of figure out and solidify their plans next spring. So the spring of 2026, that's when we start to see some waitlist movement, right? Especially if there are folks who are sitting on a couple of acceptances. And then we see med schools begin typically June, July, August of that following summer. So again, you can see from prep all the way to matriculation, right? It does take us about 2 years. All right. So I want to launch into a couple final bits of advice before I give you all some time for questions. So first and foremost would be that I want you to limit your time reading other people's personal statements. I know that there are a lot of great samples on the internet. I know even here on Leland, right? On Leland Plus, there's some really great samples that you can go through. What I don't want to have happen is that you spend so much time looking at those samples that you forget that there's no one right way to do this, right? Your personal statement has to sound like you. There's not a one size fits all. And so I really want you to keep in mind that just because it doesn't look exactly like you think this thing that you read online, that doesn't mean it's wrong, right? So sometimes reading a few can be helpful to kind of get an idea of like structure and lay of the land. But ultimately, I don't want you to spend too much time on there. I don't want you to overthink your first draft. When you're writing down ideas, start out with a really like sketch outline, right? Like jot down real quick, okay, these are the experiences I've had. This is an exercise I do with students all the time. We make a T chart. We put all of your experiences on one side of it, do that brain dump first, and then we go back in and we add in the competencies you feel like you developed, and then maybe some notes about a specific story you could tell that exemplifies that experience, right? So don't overthink it. Just get something down on paper. Give yourself time. So again, this also applies to folks who might be applying a little bit later in the cycle, right? I want you to apply when you're your best applicant. I don't want you to rush it. I don't want you to worry about what other people on the internet are saying. On that note, I would say the number one tip I can give you when it comes to this process is to stay off of Reddit and Student Doctor Network and any of those other websites and online platforms, right, where you're maybe getting some of your information. Yes, I'm a coach. Yes, I make my living working with students and helping them to find ways to get to med school, right, and helping them to make meaning of their experience. That being said, I have watched so many applicants over the years who get on Reddit at 2 a.m. and they're in a straight panic, right? Because you've gone to Reddit with your really weird, really nuanced situation about not taking your MCAT until July, and some loser on the internet who's never even heard of the MCAT application tells you that you're not getting into med school. And I can promise you that that's not true. What I always tell folks that I work with is if you wake up at 2 a.m. in a cold sweat, email me, text me, send me a message on Leland. I will be asleep, but I will get back to you with good information when I wake up in the morning, right? By 9 or 10 a.m., I will have you a really solid answer, right? That is based on years of experience and working with hundreds of applicants. So I know, right, that's like yes, it probably sounds like a coaching pitch, but I am promising you, even if we never see each other again after this, I hope that's not the case. But if I could give you one tip, it would be stay off of Reddit, stay off of TikTok, stay off of Student Doctor Network when it comes to getting advice for all of those things. That's the end of my soapbox. As I mentioned before, I want to make sure that you maintain your voice, that you highlight your unique point of view, right? And that all kind of comes back to remembering that this is your journey and that everyone else's is going to look a little bit different. And that is A-okay. It's totally fine. So as we move into questions here, I do have a QR code here on the screen if you want to set up a free intro call with me. So those free intro calls, it'll direct you directly to my LinkedIn or my Leland page, not my LinkedIn page. My Leland page, you'll be able to schedule a free 15-minute call so we can kind of talk a little bit more about your application. You can get some more information and make some decisions about whether or not coaching is right for you. I'm also including tonight a 25% off coupon for your first hourly coaching order with me. So if you want to go ahead and copy and paste that into a safe document on your computer, I'd encourage you to do so in case you find that you are interested in working together in the future. So I'm also going to go ahead and drop the link to my profile here in the chat so y'all have it. But while y'all are thinking on that a little bit, I do want to get to some questions. And so we're going to go ahead, and that first one was from Dashir. And so the question is, how do we go about creating an anecdotal story that is unique to your life? Like, for example, I decided in second grade my career goal, and I stuck to it because of my pediatrician and her dad, my previous pediatrician who I admired. It's a bit unoriginal, but that's my reasoning, and I don't know how to grab attention with that reason. Yeah, great question, right? I think a lot of us can probably relate to this story that we found somebody who had a job where we're like, that's it. Like, that's what I want to do. I would encourage you to think about maybe a specific example of a time that you were in the pediatrician's office and that is what made you think like this is what I want to do, right? Especially if you maybe had the chance to go back and shadow that pediatrician at some point, right? Maybe your intro is that we highlight a time where you were in the office as a child and you notice that she really listened to you, right? That she got down on your level and she made eye contact, right? And that really showed you like, oh, this person like wants to be supportive. They're really hearing me, right? And then maybe years later, you were shadowing her and you notice like that's something she still does, right? No matter if kiddos are, 3 or 4, or if they're 17 or 18, she's always looking at them right on. She's making eye contact. She's seeking to build that relationship. And then that's something that you want to incorporate into your practice, right? And that leads us really cleanly into being able to talk about your skill set. So hopefully that helps in terms of personalizing it a little bit more. The other thing I'll say is that it's not super important for you to have a really grabby hook. I know that there's a lot of, again, information on the internet about you've got to have something that like really hooks somebody from the beginning. But I have a lot of friends who work in the med school admissions space. And one of the things one of them had said to me recently was, when I'm going through applications, it's not like I'm in the bookstore and I'm looking for the next book I want to read, right? Or I'm not looking for the next book I'm going to pick for book club. I'm getting paid to read these applications and I am happy to do that. And I'm excited to do it. And I am certainly looking for skill sets that I know can be transferable to becoming a physician. But what's not going to get me to read something is just because it has a grabby hook, right? Like I'm still reading all of them. I'm not making a decision about which ones I read based on which one has the best first line, right? The way that you would in a bookstore. So hopefully that helps a little bit too. I think Ryan, I saw that you had your hand up. I don't know if that was on purpose or not, but feel free to unmute or drop things into the chat. Okay, looks like it's in the chat. How can I frame experiences that seem mundane so that they are exciting and hooking? I work in the OR and I am present while I'm there. I just don't know how to see those important experiences. Yeah, so some of this might just be some reflection, right? So maybe once you've come back from the OR, right, and you're thinking about a day where you came out and you were like, wow, like that is, I just feel this energy right now that tells me like I'm in the right place and I am doing the right thing, right? And so I would encourage you to just sit down and kind of write about that a little bit. I know that sounds a little like hippy dippy therapy journal kind of thing, right? But we want to make meaning of that experience. We want to think about what was it about that moment, right? What did you observe? Think about what did you see the physician do that maybe really demonstrated that this is a skill set that you want to use in your own practice. Think about the way that maybe your team worked together in the OR, right? What were the moments that you noticed where you all felt really connected? What competencies were present in that space? Were you relying on one another to collaborate? Were you effectively communicating? Did things get really scary and overwhelming for a minute and somebody said, hey, let's take a breath, right? And that moment of empathy and compassion kind of helped everyone to reset and move forward with intention? Or did something go wrong and you watch the physician adapt to that situation, right? So, again, I can imagine in the OR, there's a lot of wild things that happen on a day-to-day basis. But on those days where you come home and you're thinking something felt really magical about this, or, just felt really reassuring that I'm in the right place, see if you can sit down and kind of write out, what were the things that I was noticing? What happened? How might I make meaning of that for my experience? So hopefully that helps. Yeah. Sarah has a question here. So how would you connect an initial anecdote that is more about our own personal experience with a health condition, but maybe with less of an emphasis on how the doctor impacted you, but more on, it looks like maybe there was more to so sometimes I get this from folks if they went through a specific health challenge and they didn't have a doctor that was super great, right? Sometimes the reason that we're propelled towards a career is because we had a really negative experience, right? And we don't want anyone else to experience that. That being said, right, we want to be careful about how we talk about that in a personal statement, right? We certainly don't want to be seen as trashing on anybody in the profession, right? That's not a great look for us. And so what I might encourage you to think about were, maybe while you were going through this illness, was there somebody else in your life that provided that type of support that you wish you had gotten from your doctor, right? Was there maybe a nurse, right, that you saw that really helped us to connect the dots, right? And so maybe we can talk about those types of connections. I would also say that initial anecdote doesn't have to be about your personal experience. We could lead in with like, this is where my interest originally came from. And then later on, I had the chance to shadow, and here's a physician who really showed me the type of physician I want to be, right? Maybe not in specialty, but just in these are the skills that they exemplify. So certainly we can use that initial exposure, right, from our own lived experience to talk about how that propelled us to, get a job working as a medical receptionist over the summers in our hometown, or how it propelled us to start shadowing our first year of college. So again, we can kind of draw some of those through lines by just mentioning the initial interest and then saying that that drove us to medicine, which led to this next thing. So hopefully that's helpful. Advice on applying personal care giving to more general clinical experience when writing about it for work and activities. So I'm going to guess personal caregiving is more like maybe like a home health aide, or maybe even like working with a family member. And so if we're writing about that in your work and activity section, caregiver for a family member, perfect. So that's absolutely something that we can touch on, right? Especially if that's been a really meaningful part of your development, as I can imagine it would be, right? I hear that from applicants all the time. And so I think going back to those competencies and really thinking about what it helped you to learn. I can imagine, right, that especially if this was someone that you were close with beforehand, right, maybe before they had this like life-changing illness, that this required you to adapt to the situation that you were currently in, right? And so talking about the ways in which you adapted in that situation, how you demonstrated resilience, even when you were experiencing maybe a lot of emotions, right, about that family member's diagnosis, but you realized that like you had to be the strong person in the room, right? Because to put that sort of like emotional labor on them isn't fair. Right. And so maybe that's kind of the balance we talk about, is that resilience and adaptability piece. I think empathy and compassion feels like an easy connection here too, right? Being able to provide empathetic care. Maybe you highlight like a really specific scenario where you had to use your critical thinking skills, because maybe you had to figure out how to help them adapt their space at home to their situation, but maybe they didn't. So let's say maybe they didn't have the money for a hospital bed, let's say, right? Like that's a really extreme example, but let's say that that was the case. Maybe did you use your critical thinking skills to help them work through that process, right? How did you problem solve? So again, really think through the competencies, pick out 1 to 2 that you feel like you've developed. I would say that that goes for caregiving. It goes for just about any of your work and activities. Tips for writing about hobbies. Absolutely. I think adding 1, maybe 2 hobbies in your activity section is a great way to remind the committee that you are a well-rounded human being with interests outside of medicine. This is also a great place for us to just talk about how you self-care, right? How do you manage your own stress, right? So I have a lot of folks who will talk about maybe sports that they play, and how having that as part of their routine and having that 1 hour a day where they're really focused on them and their wellness helps them to clear their minds so that they're able to care for others, right? I have other folks who talk about their creative pursuits and how knitting or music or painting really helps them to think more creatively, right? Because they're doing this thing that's really tangible with their hands. And it just helps to like shift their mindset a little bit, right? We talk about like healthy escapism and like books or writing, reading, writing music even, right? And so again, I would say typically hobbies are a great way for us to talk about how and why that experience helps us to care for ourselves so that we can better care for others. All right, a question about in your personal statement, should we only write about 1 main reason on our why, or we're able to use more than 1? So this is a little bit tricky. So I would say there's probably a number of reasons you want to be a doctor, right? And so as I mentioned earlier with your body paragraphs, we're going to have 2 to 3 of those. And in my mind, those are really all different reasons that you want to be a physician, right? So maybe when we talk about your volunteer work, right, we're talking about your service orientation and how you want to be able to serve others and improve their quality of life. And so we're going to tell a story about a time that you did that. right? Then maybe we want to pull in this idea of like critical thinking and scientific inquiry. And so that's where we're really going to talk about how our research experience helped us to explore science in a new way and to explain it in a way that's accessible because of the poster presentation we did at the university symposium, right? And so that ability to help other people understand science and medicine is why you want to pursue it, right? So all of this is a long-winded way of saying it can absolutely be more than one, and that each of your body paragraphs should essentially center around like some of those competencies and why they're so important to your pursuit of medicine. You're so welcome. You guys have such good questions. This is great. All right. Well, I know we're getting to the end of our time together. Hopefully, the weather's a little nicer where you are. Warm here today in Michigan, but very, very rainy. So I am in for the night, but I'm going to stick around for a couple more minutes if folks have additional questions. But if you need to head out, that is totally fine. Again, I'm just going to drop the link to my Leland page here in the chat one more time. You get a free 15-minute intro call if you want to chat just a little bit more about your application, see if coaching might be right for you. And then you also have that discount code here on the screen if you do decide to place an hourly order with me. So super, super great to have you all here tonight. Hopefully this was helpful as you're getting ready to either apply this cycle or holding out for down the road a little bit. Either way, good luck. And if there's anything I can do, please let me know. Yeah, you're so welcome. Thanks for being here, folks. Looks like maybe that was all of our questions. So I'm going to go ahead and, one more. Is it fine if your personal statement? Oh, hey, someone else from Michigan. Okay, I love that. My best friend lives in Detroit. I'm headed down there this weekend, actually. Okay, so there was one more quick question. Is it fine if your personal statement doesn't have as many descriptive thoughts or anecdotes? Typically, we want that personal statement to again highlight specific experiences where we have demonstrated those skill sets and competencies. So, in my mind, we are hopefully looking for things that are descriptive, that make meaning of your experience. We don't want it to be too clinical. We don't want it to read too much like a science paper, but definitely something we could chat about more one-on-one. So, thank you, folks, so much for being here. Looking forward to hopefully connecting with some of you soon. Have a great rest of your night.